difficult set task that's before them. It can only be a time to be rejoiced, to be glad at some future time. One could possibly eventually count it all joy at that time, but sometimes it takes a little while to appreciate and get an understanding of the event. We can only begin to see tears as sacred waters of joy and cleansing after the light of God has shined on these tears and through them. It is at this time we begin to see, and we begin to separate light from darkness, sin from God's will, organization from chaos, as did God in creation for man by Jesus Christ. This separation brings one to solitude, and solitude communion increases with the one true living God. We appreciate the offering made for our sins, even if we intellectually only process them at one time. And then we begin to call it belief. It allows for the decision for us to choose this day to be with God on higher ground and to be more clear and in focus. Our relative value of expenditures minus liabilities becomes focused. We begin to love ourselves for once, and sometimes we even call it being born again, and therefore we can love somebody else, our neighbor, and then begin to love God for the first time in truth, in wisdom, and in spirit. We look around at our higher success is at Jesus' cost, and in particular at his blood cost. It is grace, God's riches at Christ's expense, that allows us to intellectually and then later gestalt the idea that is by identification with the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, as opposed to making a differentiation. We begin to get wisdom, and that's not by finding differences as aforementioned with them. This is the appreciation of the social capital and their social capital, which is spiritually subdermal as opposed to superficial and seen in the face as a standard of beauty, of skin color, or what have you. Profession, outward wealth being expressed. What we do for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow becomes focused at this time, becomes our life purpose. We cut our umbilical cord to the world and begin to focus on what God considers relative value. This is unless we do not understand this umbilical cord needs to be cut and what is connected to, namely the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. Otherwise, we continue to be a little bit more immature instead of being born again and seeking him daily in a sense of spirit and truth. Period. This actually allows us to be away from the occasional desire to want to go back to being connected physically with that world and its lust. In the world, the relative value of affirmative action is attacked at this time. Its relative value is questioned. The profit of its relative value is questioned, namely due to competition for federal dollars by community colleges and other universities dedicated to minority tag dollars and tax breaks. To be more specific, corporate social capital and the social capital of a man is questioned, especially that is of a black man. Its ratio, social capital to corporate social capital, diminishes. That's reference to. Texas Southern University at this time is being attacked because of its social capital versus corporate social capital ratio through an attack on its former president. Because of the effect that the university has on the world community, namely in the legal, business, and pharmaceutical areas, it brings into question, is this the motive for this attack? This is despite inadequate funding that Texas Southern University functions on a high level with respect to its graduates and those who go out into the community to be of social capital. The CIA, however, is allowed to perpetuate its barbaric, unchecked, and uncivilized course of action in behalf of clients at the expense of the U.S. citizens domestic cocaine sales. That's reference 5 and 6. A former U.S. private, along with one accomplice, bombs the Oklahoma Federal Building. The Turner Diaries is said to be his Bible, justifying his actions. A document that targets black leadership, black judges, white presidents, white people in leadership in the federal government, and federal leadership in general, to the point of having a system hit list. A physician in Houston is charged with 54 counts of conspiracy to illegally distribute drugs with an international group of pharmacists. The chief DEA agent over the task force tells him that he is competing with the aforementioned drug sale. And this is one of the reasons why the task force has been organized and spent over $1 million to procure him. There are also millions of dollars in assets seized from individuals aforementioned with respect to pharmacists and doctors. And they are still in limbo and will be until the outcome of the trial and the case. What do these events have in common, and what are their differences? What in America does this have to do with love? And the point of the matter, what America are you supposed to do is what Americans do. Yes, since the country is governed, funded, and legislated on the basis and for corporate America, we've emulated and attempted to duplicate the success of the corporate model since the Industrial Revolution. As a matter of fact, there's been an evolution of the corporate model to be one that has progressively been more people-oriented and social-oriented, meaning that there's no longer a hierarchy, not as much of a hierarchy when J. Paul Getty was running it, and some of the great folks back in the day in New York, whose name escapes me now. This expense of cooperating, this attempt at imitating the success of the corporate America model ends in us adopting a corporate emulation at the expense of cooperating with the community for the good of the community as a whole. This is particularly true of the church. My spiritual gift may be more or less than my donations, and that would be contingent upon my social capital versus corporate social capital ratio, whether there is a building campaign going on, an anniversary of one sort or another happening for me to make a donation. Meantime, depending on our sobriety and the lack thereof, we pursue trivially the things of the world due to this appeal to our instincts and senses, including the noise it creates in the media, if we're exposed to it and to the degree we're exposed to it. The emulation of corporate America at the expense of our communion with God ends up in our return to chaos. After all, it is the relative value that anything gets and is assessed, and the relative value that determines the course of the events, are the collective will of a person, a people, a community, or a nation. The collective will expressed by, let's say, Malcolm X, could be interpreted to say that the establishment of a relative value of ex-slaves must be established and accomplished by any means necessary. An example of the residual value would be the following. Computer geek before and after the invention and Google's birth. A black Mandingo slave before and after consensual sex with the plantation owner's wife or mulatto mistress. A 72-year-old field hand before and after 1865. A star NFL player before and after a federal conviction. A doctor with a seizure disorder before and after bumping heads with drug sales by the CIA having turned in his or her license. Without interpretation for the reader, there's an obvious dichotomy in the residual value, and is contingent upon the time at which the residual value is assessed. The most striking thing about the above examples is that the legal system seeks to maintain the residual value, the relative value of the ruling class system by control of what is legal and illegal within the assessment of the residual value. those who have control of relative value legislation, including blacks and Caucasians, have little interest in changing the rules of the relative value. They only care to determine whether it is a threat or enhancement to their relative value. The most primitive defense mechanism is projection. In the corporate America model, there is a profound disdain of a given person entity's residual value as it is judged or not to judge a greater corporate social capital versus social capital versus social capital to corporate social capital ratio. The projection that's involved with these individuals involves them blaming the individual or the group for, in essence, what they're guilty of, organized crime, when in fact all that it is a disorganized effort to establish a relative value within that community entity, which is incorrectly labeled a crime. The disorganization, contingent upon the relative value and social capital, is related to whether or not it relates to the stranger, the orphan, or the widow. The actual relative value is contingent upon the pre-event faith, connection, communion. I call that with God. That's the FCG. And its conception. Social capital is not of corporate social capital necessarily, and ends in faith, community, connection, communion with God. Anything that is accomplished will be contingent upon maintaining the FCG hookup, despite the persecution that might be present at the time and the lack of resources in between the commitment to the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Again, a dichotomy exists with the golden rule. They who have the golden rules and then make the rules as to what the hierarchy of relative value is. With legislative and media powers, these myths of relative value and corporate social capital being above social capital continue to exist in these years, including 2007. And entitlement at this time is the rule of the land that's perpetuated through the generations. That will end the reading for today. We hope that